A warrior who fights for a code of honor in a feudal society. A hero who fights for his own code in an untamed frontier. The samurai or ronin of Japanese cinema, and the cowboy or gunslinger of the American Western film genre. These archetypal film heroes come from two different worlds, yet in some ways they are two sides of the same coin, brothers from another mother. Perhaps this is why these two film genres have had a strange relationship over the years. You might say a reciprocal relationship, with one genre being influenced by the other, then the reverse, and back and forth. In fact, the countries that created these two genres have also had an odd relationship over the years, sometimes reciprocal and sometimes antagonistic. It began when the American Commodore Perry forced Japan to trade with the West near the end of the Edo period, then continued when the two nations fought each other during the Second World War, and then when America occupied Japan and enacted the constitution that Japan still uses to this day. For good or ill, these two nations have had a strange relationship for a long time. And over the years, the interplay between what might seem like vastly different cultures has manifested in art, and as we will explore in this video, cinema. At their best, Japanese samurai cinema and American westerns each embody the national character of their native country. And yet, while each country is culturally distinct, the stories and characters of each genre seem to fit seamlessly into one another, crossing cultural boundaries.
You like samurai swords. I like baseball.
To explore this further, let's start at the beginning. The first Western on film is thought to be Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery, which premiered in 1903, only around 7 years after the Lumiere brothers started screening what many consider to be the first films, period. The genre began to develop its own cinematic language during cinema's silent era, with notable films like Hell's Hinges, The Iron Horse, and Three Bad Men. However, the most iconic films of the Western genre developed during its golden era, from the late 1930s to the early 1960s, with classics of the genre like High Noon, Shane, Rio Bravo, and the films of the most influential director of Westerns, John Ford, like Stagecoach, The Searchers, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
I'll get it, Liberty.
I said you, Liberty.
Ford, as well as other directors like Howard Hawks and Raoul Walsh, started making westerns in the silent era and brought the genre through its infancy into the height of its cultural influence. After this peak, other filmmakers would adopt and reimagine the western, creating some of the greatest examples of the genre, but I'll get to them later. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, or rather back in Japan, the samurai film genre experienced a similar rise and peak, beginning in the early 1900s when the father of Japanese cinema, Shozo Makino, began creating the first samurai short films, called Jidaigeki, or period dramas. Makino, as well as most other early Japanese directors and producers, had started in kabuki theater, and the earliest samurai films were often direct adaptations of popular kabuki plays. Jidaigeki films quickly developed with silent samurai films like Orochi the Serpent, Kurama Tengu, and Shozo Makino's magnum opus, Chukon Garitsu. In the early days of silent cinema, foreign films from America and Europe were popular in Japan, and in fact were translated live by traditional Japanese performers and early film localizers called benshi. It is difficult to say what effect American silent films, and specifically westerns, had on Japanese filmmakers during the silent era. But during the golden era of Japanese cinema, directors began to wear their influences from Western filmmakers on their sleeve, and often name-dropped the king of the American Western, John Ford. For example, Kihachi Okamoto, director of Samurai Assassin and The Sword of Doom, was inspired to become a filmmaker after seeing Ford's film, Stagecoach. Masaki Kobayashi, director of Samurai Rebellion and my personal favorite samurai film, Harakiri, admitted in a 1993 interview to being deeply influenced by American directors like Ford and Frank Capra. And the most influential director of samurai films, Akira Kurosawa, frequently mentioned Ford as an influence in interviews. Kurosawa in particular is regarded as the most stylistically Western Japanese director during the golden age of Japanese cinema, and remains the most influential Japanese filmmaker internationally. Kurosawa's Jidaigeki film, Rashomon, brought Japanese cinema to the international market unlike any film before it, and later his epic, Seven Samurai, became the most iconic samurai film ever. The influence of Hollywood on early Japanese cinema and the samurai genre is not surprising, because in the early days of cinema, Hollywood quickly established itself as the leading film industry in the world. Not only Japan, but most of the world was influenced by Hollywood films. However, what happened after Kurosawa and others brought Japanese cinema to the rest of the world is interesting, because a wave of cinematic influence from Japan began to roll back the other way, into the West. When Kurosawa's Seven Samurai was released in America in 1956, it met far greater acclaim than it had received domestically. Parallels between the samurai epic and the American Western were drawn immediately by critics, and the concept of adapting the film into a Western was conceived by several producers at pretty much the same time. Ultimately, actor Yul Brynner and producer Walter Mirisch acquired the rights to Kurosawa's film, and handed it to the director of Gunfight at the OK Corral, John Sturges, resulting in the 1960 film, The Magnificent Seven. The story of 7 Ronin hired to protect a farming village from bandits became the story of 7 gunfighters hired to protect a Mexican village from a gang of bandidos. Although 7 Samurai is set in rural Japan during the late 1500s, and The Magnificent Seven is set in Mexico during the late 1800s, the universal themes and archetypal characters of the former easily translate to the latter. The motley crew of hired muscle, led by a wise veteran and aided by a young fiery warrior who's coming to terms with his own identity, fits both settings, and of course is helped by the amazing cast of both films.
You yourself are a farmer.
Yes.
The Magnificent Seven became one of the most highly acclaimed westerns ever, but was also viewed by some, like the director John Carpenter, as the last hurrah of the American Western, at least as it was during the Golden Era. In the early 1960s, American westerns had become somewhat repetitive and were declining in popularity in their country of origin. However, their popularity continued to thrive overseas. Since the early days of the Western, Europe proved to be a popular market for the genre. Italy, in particular, loved the Western and began creating their own Westerns as early as 1913, with La Vampira Indiana. In the early 1960s, the Italian director Sergio Leone believed there was still a market for Westerns in Europe, and wished to reinvent the genre for a new age. Rather than choosing a classic tale of the American Old West to adapt, he chose to adapt Kurosawa's 1961 samurai comedy, Yojimbo. Yes, Leone was an Italian director adapting a Japanese samurai film and setting it in the American Old West, but shooting it in Spain as part of an Italian production with what was at the time a B-list American TV star in the lead. Seems like a pretty odd combination. But then again, it's not that odd because a Kurosawa film had previously been adapted into a very successful Western, and like Kurosawa, Leone was an admitted disciple of John Ford. The story of a Ronin during the late Edo period who wanders into a town with 2 rival gangs and tries to play both sides against each other is easily translated to the Old West, with a wandering gunfighter who does the same. The success of Fistful of Dollars sparked the spaghetti western craze in Italy, and also a lawsuit with Toho because Leone had failed to secure the rights to the story.
I don't think it's nice you laughing.
Taking a cue from Leone, Spanish directors Eugenio Martin and Jose Marino partially adapted Masaki Kobayashi's samurai film Harakiri in 1968. Requiem for a Gringo is a decent spaghetti western, or I guess tortilla western, but doesn't even attempt to translate the culturally specific aspects of Harakiri, like the whole Harakiri part, and is more an interesting revenge tale with a very loose resemblance to the classic samurai film. 3 years later, Ferdinando Baldi's spaghetti western, Blind Man, followed this trend, adapting the premise of the popular Japanese swordplay film series Zatoichi, this time with a blind gunslinger in the lead rather than a blind swordsman. But Blind Man didn't adapt the plot of any Zatoichi film in particular.
Well, sweet mama, I guess the sun don't shine on the same dog's ass all the time.
Italian or European directors helped to keep the Western alive during the mid-1960s to mid-1970s, while the genre's popularity waned in its home country. Despite this, some of the more critically acclaimed American-made Westerns premiered during this era, like The Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and The Outlaw Josie Wales. But Westerns were more infrequent, and represented a new revisionist style of Western that played against traditional genre tropes, rather than glorifying America's frontier past. The Western was not dead, but it had been irrevocably changed and remade for a new era. The 1970s did, however, mark the first true samurai/western crossover, with the French-Italian-Spanish co-production Red Sun in 1971, starring Kurosawa go-to actor Toshiro Mifune and Once Upon a Time in the West star Charles Bronson. The film follows a samurai on a mission to deliver a valuable sword to the American president, but when the sword is stolen, he must team up with a cowboy outlaw to retrieve it. While Red Sun is not the greatest example of either genre, it is an admirable attempt to fuse the two.
Hell, you think I'm gonna hit a man who can't even make a fist?
In Japan, by the early 1970s, the era of the samurai epic as high art began to disappear as the result of competition from television, and was replaced with lower-budget Chambara films, a term which means swordplay film, and is generally a more violent, action-driven subgenre of Jidaigeki, like the aforementioned Zatoichi series, Lone Wolf and Cub series, or Lady Snowblood. When Toho failed to complete Kurosawa's latest Jidaigeki project, Kagemusha, in the late 70s, the American directors George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola stepped in and convinced 20th Century Fox to back the film. Both Lucas and Coppola were admitted students of Kurosawa's work, and in fact Lucas admitted that Star Wars was partly inspired by Kurosawa's 1958 samurai film, The Hidden Fortress.
I was really intrigued by was the fact that the story was told from the two lowest characters. I decided that that would be a nice way to tell Star Wars.
The two American directors' support of Kagemusha gave them a chance to give back to the Japanese director who had taught them so much, and the film went on to win the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival in 1980. The American Western didn't exactly die in the 1980s, but the genre's popularity continued to wane. My personal favorite Western of the 1980s, however, is not American, or even European, it's Japanese. The 1985 Japanese film Tampopo is not a Western in the traditional sense, given that it is set in modern Japan, doesn't include a gun duel, and focuses mainly on the struggles of a ramen shop owner. But its director Juzo Itami was clearly inspired by American Westerns, and included a number of Western tropes in Tampopo.
お兄さん、喧嘩売るならどうだろう。俺に直接売ってくれねえか。
The 1990s marked a short-lived revival of the Western back in the States, due firstly to the enormous financial and critical success of Kevin Costner's film Dances with Wolves. Although that film is more of a historical drama set in the American frontier than a Western in the traditional narrative sense. By the 1990s, that B-list American TV star I mentioned earlier had gone on to become one of the most respected actors and directors in Hollywood, and in fact helped to keep the American-made Western alive during the 1970s and 80s. 2 years after Dances with Wolves, Clint Eastwood released his most heralded Western, Unforgiven, which follows an aging bounty hunter who is drawn back into his profession years after attempting to retire. Unforgiven paralleled the state of the American Western at the time, as Eastwood's character, William Money, looks back cynically on his time as a gunfighter, and must at last atone for the lives he took. It is a raw, unglorified look at what was once the glorified hero archetype of the Old West.
It's a hell of a thing, killing a man. You take away all he's got, and all he's ever gonna have.
Like Dances with Wolves, Unforgiven cleaned up at the Oscars, and marked a high point for the Western during the 1990s. The samurai cinema revival hit Japan more so around the year 2000, with critically acclaimed samurai films like After the Rain, The Twilight Samurai, and When the Last Sword is Drawn. The American director Edward Zwick even got in on the action by putting Tom Cruise in a suit of samurai armor and telling the story of an American soldier in Japan during the Satsuma Rebellion. Quentin Tarantino's outspoken appreciation for spaghetti westerns and Chambara films was fused in the early 2000s for Kill Bill Volume 1 and 2. Later, Tarantino produced and starred in a more authentic samurai western crossover, Sukiyaki Western Django in 2007, directed by Takashi Miike. But a better Western samurai crossover appeared 6 years later, when Ken Watanabe, star of Clint Eastwood's Letters from Iwo Jima, adapted Clint Eastwood's earlier film, Unforgiven. This 2013 remake, directed by Lee Sang-il, once again demonstrates how easily adaptable samurai cinema is to the Western, or rather, vice versa. At this point, it's hard to remember who's adapting who. The setting of Wyoming in 1881 is adapted to the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido around the same time, 1880. This era is 12 years into the Meiji Restoration, and technically after the end of the samurai class. But like in Eastwood's Unforgiven, the protagonist, Jubei the Killer, represents a throwback to an older era, in this case the age of the samurai, rather than the age of the gunslinger. In both films, this older age, represented by the protagonist, comes into conflict with a newer age, represented by Sheriff Daggett in the original and Lawman Oishi in the remake. Since Watanabe's Unforgiven, both samurai cinema and westerns have continued on, and may even be poised for a full-blown revival in the coming years. But I'll leave the history of the relationship between the two genres at Unforgiven. The western and samurai cinema seem to translate easily from one to the other, but why exactly is that? What do samurai or ronin and the American cowboy or gunslinger have in common? I believe the biggest parallel is that both are heroes with a moral code, who use their skill and wit to fight for this code in a world that opposes it. Whether it is in the setting of the untamed and lawless American frontier, or the conflict and political intrigue of feudal Japan, the hero uses their skill and courage to keep their ideals alive, against all odds. In theory, any classical hero that shares these features could easily translate from one genre to another, but crossovers and adaptations between westerns and samurai cinema seem to produce great results pretty much every time. Now if only someone would adapt Takashi Miike's 13 Assassins into a western, because that would be badass. What are your favorite western/samurai crossover films or adaptations? And what films of either genre would you like to see translated into the other? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe, check out these other videos, and if you want to support the channel and help me create more videos more often, please donate to the channel Patreon, listed in the description below. Until next time, keep your saddle oiled and your katana greased.